Stress is a state of mental or emotional strain resulting from threatening or demanding circumstances, and its physiological reaction is known as a stress response. If a stimulus produces a stress response, it is considered a stressor. Stress disrupts the homeostatic ability of the body to maintain the right hormones, temperature, pH, and overall balance, as the autonomic nervous system shifts its focus from the parasympathetic nervous system to the sympathetic nervous system and prepares the body for fight or flight. Then the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, or HPA axis, acts to secrete glucocorticoids to regulate digestion, energy expenditure, the immune system, reproduction, and emotion. Both arms of the stress response are modulated through the limbic system, a group of structures in the brain that work together to process emotion, memory, and learning. When a real or perceived threat is imminent, the central nucleus part of the lateral amygdala processes the information and sends out distress signals to activate the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and sympathomedullary pathway. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted from the adrenal medulla, and the fight or flight response is in action. Energy used in the digestive system are redirected to pump blood around the muscles and vital organs. Opening airways of the lungs will send more oxygen to the brain and will work to improve alertness and sharpness of all senses. Blood pressure and heart rate elevates, pupils dilate, and the perspiration increases. The SNS ensures the aversive information is stored as long-term memory in the hippocampus and striatum, as this helps to prepare the brain for recurrent stresses. Once the sympathetic nervous system has acted, the amygdala projects to the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis and innervates the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. Corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, and arginine vasopressin, AVP, is released into the hypophyseal portal system for it to act on its receptors in the anterior pituitary. Once activated, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is synthesized and secreted from corticotroph cells of the pituitary and into the bloodstream. ACTH stimulates the production and release of glucocorticoid hormones through the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex. Cortisol is the main glucocorticoid steroid hormone produced during the stress response, and it is a catalyst for the redistribution of glucose stores around the body, suppression of the immune system, and the body to be on high alert and ready to face any imminent danger. When the threat passes, cortisol levels decrease as the parasympathetic nervous system takes over and the hippocampus exerts its inhibiting effect on the HP axis in an attempt to restore homeostasis. Now, stresses are abundant in our day-to-day lives, but how we adapt to stress is crucial to maintaining our sense of well-being, perception, and overall health. These standard mechanisms are normal responses to acute stress, although when the stress response becomes chronic, the brain undergoes adaptive changes to cope with the stress, which can lead to long-term detrimental effects. The overload of neural activity in the amygdala results in long exposure to cortisol, and when cortisol levels are too high, synaptic connections between neurons deteriorate and the prefrontal cortex shrinks in size. Excessive cortisol reduces the production of new brain cells in the hippocampus, and because the hippocampus is responsible for inhibiting the HPA axis, the brain's ability to control and overcome stress declines. Along with this, individuals under chronic stress are more likely to overreact when faced with stresses, as chronic stress causes hypertrophy in the zona fasciculata, the layer of cells in the adrenal cortex responsible for synthesizing and secreting glucocorticoids. When the brain adapts to an overwhelming amount of stress for extended periods of time, these changes become increasingly permanent and harder to reverse. When stresses are exposed to younger children, their brains can undergo epigenetic changes during the developmental stage that resulted in their stress response to be more sensitive and overactive. A group of studies showed that rats raised by nurturing mothers through frequent grooming were more resistant to stress. Their brains had developed more cortisol receptors, whereas the brains of neglected rats underwent methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene, downregulating the inhibitory action of the hippocampus. The neglected rats had a larger hypothalamus because they experienced enhanced activation of the HPA axis and an elevated SNS arousal at a young age of development. These epigenetic changes led these rats to show larger and more frequent stress responses to the environment as their ability to process and overcome stress was impaired. So that is why it is important for parents and caretakers are educated about the consequences of a non-nurturing childhood, as this will prevent future generations from experiencing these behavioural drawbacks. Across the globe, individuals are expected to achieve higher than ever in schooling and work, whilst also maintaining a healthy social and family life. Examined over a period of 5 years, Australians are experiencing more frequent and significant stress over the time period, and due to a fast developing economy, these statistics can be linked to growth of housing prices, consumer goods, and populations. Lack of control, heightened pressure, and overload of responsibilities are only a few ways to induce stress. The brain overcomes stress better when the mind and body are stable, and in order for a healthy stress response to occur, the HPA axis must be rebalanced. By implementing exercise, meditation, sun exposure in an individual's life, the individual is more cognitively prepared against stressful encounters, and the chances of acute stress becoming chronic are minimized.